It was one of those perfect, crisp mornings that I usually look forward to all week. The sky was clear, just a hint of pink still clinging to the horizon from the sunrise, and the water was calm, barely a ripple. I had my rod in hand, just sitting there, waiting for the first bite of the day. There's a certain peace you get when you're out on the lake that early, you know? Just you, the water, and the quiet hum of the world waking up around you. It felt like any other morning, the kind that makes you forget about everything else for a little while. Then my phone buzzed. I almost ignored it. I mean, I was out there to escape all that noise, not answer phone calls. But something in the back of my mind told me to check. Maybe it was the timing, or maybe just a gut feeling, but I picked up my phone and saw Dad's name flash on the screen. Weird. He never called this early. My hand hesitated before swiping to answer, but eventually, I did. That's when everything changed. His voice was shaky, Dad never sounded shaky, and all he said was, "She's gone." My heart stopped for a second, or maybe more. I didn't understand. I sat there with the rod still in my hand, staring out at the water as his words sunk in, like slow, heavy weights dragging my mind down. "Your mom," he added, and that's when it hit me. Mom was gone. Something about a hospital infection. Something they couldn't fix. I remember the way the fish stopped biting after that. Not like they'd been biting much before, but after that phone call, the lake itself seemed to go still, as if it knew. I just sat there, staring out at the water, my line dangling uselessly in the silent lake. I didn't know what to do. It was like the world had shifted around me, but I was stuck, anchored to that spot with the rod still in my hand, casting out again and again, like somehow catching a fish would make it all make sense. But nothing made sense. Not the fact that she was healthy just a few weeks ago. Not the fact that she'd gone into the hospital for something routine and didn't come out. And definitely not the fact that she wasn't going to be there when I went home. All I could do was sit there, feeling the weight of that rod in my hand, trying to focus on the water, trying to keep doing what I always did out there, but it wasn't working. The fish weren't biting, and my thoughts were swirling around like a storm I couldn't get away from. I'd always thought the lake was where I could find some peace, but that morning, there was no peace to be found. Just me and the emptiness that came with the news, the sound of the water barely breaking the silence that had settled around me like a heavy blanket. It felt wrong to just leave, like leaving the lake would make it all real, like I'd have to go back and face the fact that everything had changed. So, I just stayed. Stayed there with my rod in hand, casting out into the quiet water, even though I knew there was no point. What else could I do? I don't know how long I sat there, casting and reeling in the line, not really expecting anything. Time felt like it had stopped, like the world outside of the lake didn't exist anymore. Every now and then, I checked my phone, like I was expecting another call to tell me it was some kind of mistake. But there was nothing. Just that one call from Dad, and now this overwhelming silence. The lake was usually my escape, the place I'd come to get away from everything, but now it felt different. The stillness wasn't peaceful anymore. It was heavy, like the weight of everything I was trying to ignore had settled over the water and wrapped itself around me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, not just with Mom being gone, but with me being out there while it happened. Like I should have been somewhere else, like I'd missed something important. The sun climbed higher, warming my back, but I barely noticed. The light breeze that used to calm me now felt like it was pushing me to make a decision I wasn't ready to make. Go home, go to Dad, face what happened, do something. But I wasn't ready. Not yet. I thought about Mom. I thought about how she used to come out here with me sometimes, even though she didn't care much for fishing. She'd just sit in the boat with a book, sipping coffee from that thermos she always brought, smiling whenever I reeled in something half-decent. She wasn't much of a talker when we were out on the water, but she didn't need to be. Her presence was enough. Just knowing she was there made those trips feel whole. And now, she wasn't. She wasn't anywhere. The thought hit me like a punch to the gut. I felt the tears start to well up in my eyes, but I blinked them away. Crying wouldn't change anything. It wouldn't bring her back. I swallowed the lump in my throat, cast the line out again, and watched the bobber float aimlessly on the surface of the water. I don't know why I stayed. Maybe it was because fishing had always been something steady in my life. No matter what happened, I could always come back to it, rely on it to make sense. But this didn't make sense. None of it did. Eventually, I started to think about heading back. The weight of what I had to do next, tell people, plan a funeral, deal with the endless condolences from folks who didn't really know her, started to creep in. But I still couldn't bring myself to reel in the line and go. It felt like if I left that spot, if I packed up and went home, then it was real. Then Mom was really gone, and there was no coming back from that. But I knew I couldn't stay out there forever. The sun was getting higher, and the breeze was picking up. The lake, once so calm, was starting to stir a bit. I stared at the water, thinking about all the times I'd been out here with her. Her laugh, her quiet presence in the boat, the way she always seemed to know when I was frustrated without me saying a word. Finally, I reeled in the line, the sound of the reel cutting through the quiet. I packed up my tackle box, the clinking of lures and hooks strangely loud in the stillness. I took one last look at the lake, its surface starting to ripple with the breeze. It didn't feel like the same place anymore. I stood up, grabbed my gear, and made my way back to the shore. My legs felt heavy, like they didn't want to carry me back to the world that was waiting for me. But I knew I had to go. There was no escaping what had happened. Not out here, not anywhere. As I stepped off the dock and onto the dirt path, I glanced back at the lake one more time. It looked the same as it always did, but I knew it wasn't. I wasn't the same either. With a deep breath, I turned and started walking, the weight of what lay ahead pressing down on me with every step. Each step I took away from the lake felt heavier than the last, like the weight of reality was sinking into me, bit by bit. The path that led back to the car was a short one, but it felt like it stretched on forever. I didn't know what I'd say to Dad when I got home. What do you say after news like that? Nothing seemed right. There wasn't a word or sentence that could fix it, nothing that would change the fact that Mom wasn't going to be there anymore. As I reached the car, I dropped my gear into the trunk, trying to keep my hand steady. It felt wrong to be doing something so routine when everything had just fallen apart. I sat down in the driver's seat and stared out at the lake one more time. It was beautiful, calm, completely unchanged. The kind of scene that should have brought me some peace. But all I felt was emptiness. I don't know how long I sat there, just staring out the windshield. Time didn't really matter right then. It felt like I was stuck in some weird in-between moment, where everything was frozen, and I didn't have to deal with what came next. But I knew I couldn't sit there forever. Eventually, the world would start moving again, and I'd have to catch up. With a sigh, I started the car and pulled out onto the dirt road that led back home. The gravel crunched beneath the tires, and I let the noise fill the silence in my head. It felt better than thinking. Better than facing what I'd have to deal with when I got home. Dad would be there, probably sitting in his usual spot at the kitchen table, staring at the same cup of coffee he'd been nursing since the call came in. I thought about how he'd looked when I saw him last, tired, worn out, but still holding it together for everyone else. Dad was always like that. The strong one. But this time, I didn't know if even he could handle it. Mom had been his whole world. They weren't just married, they were partners in everything. And now she was gone, ripped away by something as senseless as an infection. How does anyone cope with that? As the house came into view, my stomach twisted into knots. The place looked the same as it always had, quiet, cozy, and unassuming. But now it felt like a stranger to me. I pulled into the driveway and sat there for a moment, letting the engine hum beneath me. I could see the front door, slightly ajar, like someone had gone out and forgotten to close it all the way. That was Dad's habit. Always in a rush, always leaving things half done. I killed the engine and got out, the door slamming behind me louder than I meant it to. I stood there for a second, breathing in the cool air, trying to steady myself. It didn't work. Nothing about this was steady. I trudged up the steps and pushed the door open, the hinges creaking as if they knew something was wrong. Inside, the house was quiet. Too quiet. No TV playing in the background, no soft music coming from the kitchen like Mom used to have on when she cooked. Just silence. I walked into the living room, and there he was, Dad, sitting at the table, staring into the distance. His coffee sat untouched, growing cold. He didn't look up when I came in, just kept his gaze fixed somewhere far beyond the walls of the house. "Hey," I said softly, not knowing what else to say. He didn't answer right away. I could see the heaviness in his eyes, like he'd aged years in the hours since I'd last seen him. Finally, he glanced at me, his face etched with the kind of grief that words couldn't touch. "She's really gone, isn't she?" I swallowed hard, nodding because I couldn't trust my voice. It was too raw, too tangled up in everything I was feeling. Dad sighed, the sound low and deep, like it came from the very bottom of his soul. "I thought I was prepared for this, you know? I thought, we have more time." I didn't know what to say to that. I wanted to tell him that it was going to be okay, that we'd get through it, but I couldn't lie. It wasn't okay. And I wasn't sure if we'd ever really get through this. So instead, I just sat down beside him at the table, letting the quiet stretch between us. For a long time, we didn't say anything. The house felt too big, too empty without her. The weight of what we'd lost hung in the air, and neither of us knew how to fill that space. We just sat there, side by side, two people who suddenly didn't know how to navigate a world without her. It was strange how the simplest things could change so much in the blink of an eye. A phone call, a few words, and everything was different. I thought about the lake, how I had tried to keep fishing after the call came in, like if I just kept doing something familiar, everything would stay normal. But it didn't. It couldn't. Nothing would ever be normal again. We sat there in silence for what felt like hours. The weight of everything made even the air in the house feel heavy. I kept waiting for Dad to say something, to make it all feel less surreal, but he just stared at the table, his hands clasped around the cold mug of coffee. It was like he was somewhere else entirely, lost in his thoughts or memories, and I didn't have the heart to pull him back. Eventually, the quiet got to me. I couldn't just sit there anymore. I stood up and wandered into the kitchen, hoping to busy myself with something, anything, to stop my mind from spiraling further. The kitchen was exactly how Mom had left it. Her apron still hung on the hook near the stove, the one she always wore when she baked. I could still picture her there, moving around effortlessly, humming to herself while she worked, always smiling. The sight of it hit me harder than I expected. I leaned against the counter, feeling the sting of tears again, but I blinked them away. Crying felt useless, like it wasn't going to solve anything. It wasn't going to bring her back. But it was hard to ignore that hollow feeling in my chest, the one that made me feel like I'd lost a part of myself along with her. I opened the fridge, hoping to find something to focus on, but even that felt wrong. All of her things were still there, the half-finished containers, the leftovers she'd probably planned to use for dinner. I closed the door quickly, not wanting to look at it anymore. Instead, I started cleaning. It was a pointless task, but it was better than sitting in that oppressive silence. As I wiped down the counters, I couldn't help but think back to when things were normal. When life was simple. When Mom would come in from her garden, covered in dirt but proud of whatever she'd harvested. I used to joke with her about how much time she spent out there, but now I'd give anything to hear her talk about her plants again, to see her smile as she showed me what she'd grown. I didn't hear Dad come into the kitchen, but when I looked up, he was standing there, watching me. His expression was hard to read, somewhere between exhaustion and grief, with a dash of something else I couldn't quite place. "You don't have to do that," he said softly, his voice hoarse. "The house, it doesn't need to be spotless." I shrugged, still wiping down the counter even though there was nothing left to clean. "I don't know what else to do." He nodded, like he understood. Maybe he did. He walked over to the sink and stared out the window for a moment. I could tell he was struggling to find the right words, the same way I had been all morning. "I keep expecting her to come through the door," he said after a long pause. Like she's just out running an errand, and any minute she'll walk in and tell us everything's fine. I didn't know how to respond to that, so I just stayed quiet. I understood exactly what he meant. It felt impossible to accept that she was gone. My brain couldn't wrap around the idea that I'd never see her again, never hear her voice calling out from the garden, or see her sitting in her favorite chair by the window. Dad sighed again, running a hand through his hair. I don't know how we're supposed to do this, Ellie. I really don't. Hearing him say that hit me hard. Dad was always the strong one, the one who held everything together when things got tough. But now, he sounded lost, like the foundation he'd built his life on had crumbled beneath him. And maybe it had. I wanted to say something, to offer some kind of comfort, but the words wouldn't come. So instead, I just walked over to him and put my hand on his shoulder. We stood there, staring out the window together, both of us trying to make sense of the new reality we were facing. Outside, the world kept turning. The trees swayed in the breeze, and the birds sang their usual songs, completely unaware of the shift in our lives. It was strange how life could just keep going on like nothing had changed, when everything for us had. After a while, Dad spoke again, his voice low. I think we should go back out to the lake tomorrow. Your mom, she loved it out there. I nodded, knowing he was right. The lake had always been a place of peace for all of us, and maybe, in some way, it would help us feel closer to her. Maybe being out on the water would remind us of the good times, the ones that didn't feel so distant yet. Yeah, I said quietly. I think that's a good idea. We stood there a little longer, neither of us really knowing what to say or do. But I could feel the weight of the day starting to settle in, the reality of what life would be like from now on. It wasn't going to be easy. It was never going to be the same. But somehow, we have to keep going. Tomorrow, we'd go back to the lake. Maybe, just maybe, we'd find some peace there. Or at least, we'd try. The next morning came sooner than I expected. I woke up early, the light filtering through the curtains, casting a dull glow across my room. I lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling, my mind already going over the plans for the day. The lake. It felt strange, almost wrong, to go back so soon after everything. But Dad had been right, Mom loved it out there. Maybe we'd find some sort of comfort. Or maybe we wouldn't. Either way, I knew we had to try. I could hear Dad moving around downstairs, the usual sounds of coffee being brewed and the creak of the old kitchen chairs. It was oddly reassuring, like some things were still the same, even though so much had changed. I got dressed slowly, pulling on my old fishing clothes, the ones that smelled like the lake and the outdoors. As I tied my boots, I thought about all the times we'd gone out there as a family. Mom would always pack a cooler full of snacks, insisting we'd need them even though we never really ate much while we fished. She'd sit on the dock with a book, pretending to be interested in whatever we caught, but I knew she mostly came along just to be with us. By the time I made my way downstairs, Dad was already standing by the door, fishing rods in hand, the cooler packed and ready to go. His eyes were tired, like he hadn't slept much. I guess neither of us had. Ready? He asked, though his voice lacked its usual energy. I nodded, grabbing my jacket and heading out the door with him. The drive to the lake was quiet, the kind of silence that felt heavy but not uncomfortable. We both had a lot on our minds, and I think neither of us wanted to break whatever fragile peace existed between us in that moment. As we pulled up to the lake, everything looked exactly as it always had. The water was calm, the trees reflected on its surface, and the morning mist hovered just above the waterline. It should have been peaceful, but today it felt different. Empty. Like something was missing. We unloaded the gear in silence, heading down to the dock without saying much. The old wooden boards creaked under our weight, the familiar sound echoing across the water. I could almost hear Mom's voice in my head, reminding us to be careful, as if we hadn't been out here 1,000 times before. We set up the rods, casting our lines into the still water. I watched the ripples spread out from where the bait hit the surface, the silence between us stretching on. Usually, fishing was a time to relax, to joke around, and let the quiet moments be a kind of comfort. But today, it felt like we were both waiting for something, maybe for the lake to give us some kind of sign, or maybe for a memory of her to fill the space that hung between us. I glanced over at Dad. He had his eyes fixed on the water, his expression unreadable, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he was gripping the rod a little too tightly. I wondered what he was thinking. If he was remembering all the times we'd been out here with Mom, the way she used to laugh when I reeled in something small, or the way she teased Dad about being outfished by his own kid. I cast my line again, the bobber floating on the surface, motionless. It was strange how something I'd done 1,000 times now felt so different. The rhythm of fishing, the calm of the lake, it wasn't the same without her. It didn't feel right, like there was this gaping hole that no amount of peaceful water could fill. After what felt like hours, Dad finally spoke. His voice was quiet, almost like he was talking to the lake itself. "She would have loved this morning," he said, not looking at me. "She always said the early mornings were the best time to be out here." I nodded, not trusting my voice to stay steady. He was right. Mom always said the lake looked its best in the early light, before the world really woke up. I could almost hear her saying it now, her voice soft and sure. We fell back into silence, but it wasn't as heavy this time. There was something about being out here, surrounded by the things she loved, that made the ache a little easier to bear. Not by much, but just enough to keep us both going. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, I realized that this was going to be our new normal. The lake wouldn't be the same, not without her, but it was still ours. And maybe that was enough. For now, it had to be. The sun climbed higher, casting a warm glow over the lake, but it did little to break the chill in the air between us. Dad and I sat there, our lines cast out, but neither of us was really fishing. It was more about the quiet, about sitting in the place Mom loved and trying to feel something other than the heavy weight of loss. The hours passed slowly, but the lake had a way of making time feel irrelevant. The world felt smaller out there, as if the only thing that mattered was the stretch of water in front of us, the slow pull of the current, and the gentle rocking of the boat. We weren't saying much, but we didn't need to. There wasn't really anything to say. I reeled in my line, checking the bait out of habit. The hook was untouched, still glistening in the early morning sun. I hadn't expected to catch anything. Truth be told, I didn't care if I did. Fishing had always been a way to clear my head, to reset. But today, the water wasn't bringing me the peace it used to. It was just reminding me of what wasn't here. I glanced over at Dad again. He hadn't moved much, his line still taut, his eyes fixed on the horizon. I wondered what was going through his mind, if he was as lost in thought as I was. "Remember that time Mom caught that huge catfish out here?" I said, the memory creeping up on me out of nowhere. Dad gave a half smile, his eyes flicking toward me briefly before returning to the water. "Yeah, she was so proud of that fish. Biggest one we'd seen out here in years." I laughed a little, despite everything. She wouldn't let us hear the end of it. For weeks, she was walking around like she'd outdone us both. Dad chuckled softly, the sound low but genuine. "She sure was proud of herself. That was Mom for you, quiet, but when she did something, she wanted you to know about it." Talking about her felt strange, but it also felt right. Like maybe if we kept her alive in our stories, and the little moments we remembered, she wouldn't feel so far away. I didn't want to forget those times, the laughter, the teasing, the way she always seemed to know how to make everything feel okay, even when it wasn't. We sat in the boat for a little while longer, sharing a few more memories. They came slowly at first, like we were both unsure of how much we could say without breaking down. But as the sun got higher and the day warmed, the memories started to flow a little easier. They were like pieces of her, scattered through the years we'd spent out here. And in a way, they made it feel like she was still with us. After a while, Dad reeled in his line and set his rod down. He leaned back in the boat, staring up at the sky. "You know," he started, his voice quiet but steady, "I don't think we ever really get over something like this. We just learn to live with it." I nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. I didn't expect to get over losing Mom. I didn't even know if I wanted to. But I knew that somehow, we have to find a way to keep going. To keep living, even though everything felt so different. I miss her, I said softly, not looking at him. It was the first time I'd said it out loud since she passed, and the words felt both heavy and freeing. I miss her too, Dad replied, his voice thick with emotion. Every damn day. The boat rocked gently beneath us, the water calm and steady. For the first time since she died, I felt a sense of peace, not because the pain was gone, but because I wasn't carrying it alone. We both missed her, we both hurt, and somehow, knowing that made it a little easier to bear. We stayed out on the lake for a few more hours, the fishing forgotten, the lines abandoned. It wasn't about that anymore. It was about being out here, in this place that had meant so much to her, and finding some small measure of comfort in the fact that we were still here, still together. When we finally packed up to leave, the sun was high in the sky, casting long shadows over the water. As we headed back to shore, I glanced at Dad, and for the first time since all of this started, I saw a little bit of the weight lift from his shoulders. Not much, but enough. As we unloaded the boat, Dad paused and looked out at the water. "We'll come back," he said, more to himself than to me. "We'll come back, and we'll be okay." I didn't know if we'd ever really be okay, but I knew we'd try. And maybe, in time, the lake would feel like home again. As we drove away, the lake disappeared in the rearview mirror, but it didn't feel so far away anymore. It felt like a part of us now, tied to Mom and everything she loved. And in that, there was a kind of peace. A small one, but enough to get through the day. The days after that trip to the lake were a blur. We fell into a kind of routine, Dad and I, though it wasn't the same as it used to be. Nothing was. I'd wake up early, sometimes before the sun even rose, and I'd find Dad already sitting at the kitchen table, staring out the window with a cup of cold coffee in front of him. He wasn't one to talk much these days, and neither was I, so we'd sit in silence, the house too quiet around us. I went back to work, though it felt strange to be out in the world, pretending like everything was normal when it wasn't. People would ask me how I was doing, and I'd give them the same rehearsed answer, "I'm fine." But I wasn't fine. I was just there, going through the motions because I didn't know what else to do. Dad kept busy with projects around the house. Fixing things that didn't need fixing, cleaning things that were already spotless. I think it helped him to keep his hands moving, to stay occupied, because the moments when he stopped, those were the hardest. I could see it in his eyes when he'd sit down at the end of the day, the way he'd stare at the empty chair where Mom used to sit, like he was waiting for her to walk in any minute. But she never would. One afternoon, about a week after we'd gone to the lake, Dad came into the living room where I was sitting. He stood there for a moment, like he wasn't sure what to say, his hands fidgeting with the brim of his old baseball cap. "I've been thinking," he said finally, his voice quiet but steady. "Maybe we should take another trip out to the lake. You know, like we used to." I looked up at him, surprised. We hadn't talked much about going back since that first time, and I hadn't been sure if either of us was ready. But there was something in his eyes that told me he needed this, that maybe being out on the water again would help, even just a little. "Yeah," I nodded, setting down the book I hadn't really been reading. "I think that's a good idea." The next morning, we packed up the truck again, much like we had before. But this time, there was a different feeling in the air. It wasn't as heavy. There was still grief, still that deep ache that came with missing her, but there was also a sense of purpose. Like maybe we were trying to move forward, even if we weren't sure how. The drive to the lake was quiet, but it didn't feel uncomfortable. It was a shared silence, the kind that comes when two people are lost in their own thoughts, but still connected in some way. I watched the scenery blur past, the trees swaying gently in the breeze, the sky a pale blue that stretched on forever. The world outside looked the same as it always had, but I knew it wasn't. Not for us. When we got to the lake, the water was just as still and calm as it had been before. It was early, and the mist was still hanging over the surface, giving everything a soft, almost dreamlike quality. I breathed in the cool air, letting it fill my lungs and settle something deep inside me. We unloaded the gear and walked down to the dock. Dad didn't say much, just handed me my rod and set up his own. The quiet between us was different this time, less about what we'd lost, and more about just being there, together. It felt peaceful, in a way. Like the lake was giving us something we hadn't realized we needed. We cast our lines out, the bobbers floating gently on the water. There was something comforting in the familiarity of it, the way the ripples spread out from where the bait hit the surface, the steady rhythm of reeling in and casting out again. It was a simple thing, but it felt like a connection to something bigger, something that went beyond the grief and the loss. For a long time, we didn't talk. We just fished, the quiet punctuated by the occasional splash of a fish jumping or the call of a bird overhead. I could feel some of the tension start to unwind from my shoulders, the weight of everything we'd been carrying these past few months easing just a little. After a while, Dad spoke, his voice soft and thoughtful. "You know, your mom would have loved this day. She always said there was something special about the lake in the fall." I smiled, remembering how she used to talk about the changing leaves and the crisp air. "Yeah, she did. She always said the cooler weather brought out the best in the lake." Dad nodded, his gaze fixed on the water. I think she was right. We fell back into silence after that, but it was a comfortable one. There was something about being out there, surrounded by the things Mom had loved, that made it feel like she was with us in some way. Not physically, of course, but in the memories and the shared moments that came flooding back every time we cast our lines into the water. The sun started to sink lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the lake, and I realized we'd been out there for hours without really noticing the time. It felt good, though. Healing, in a way. Like we were taking small steps towards something, maybe not closure, but at least a kind of acceptance. As we packed up our gear and headed back to the truck, I felt lighter than I had in weeks. The grief was still there, but it wasn't as all-consuming as it had been. And I knew that Dad felt it too, even if he didn't say anything. We'd come back to the lake, and we'd be back again. It was our place now, a connection to her and to each other. And that was enough. For now, it was enough. Over the next few weeks, Dad and I settled into a routine. Life didn't get easier, but it got manageable, like we were slowly learning how to carry the weight of everything. We went back to the lake a few more times, and each trip felt a little different. Not better, exactly, but less heavy. The water had a way of helping us forget, even if only for a few hours. One morning, Dad came into the kitchen with a thoughtful look on his face. I was halfway through a cup of coffee, still waking up, when he spoke. "I've been thinking," he said, sitting down across from me. "Maybe we should fix up the old cabin by the lake." I blinked, not expecting that. The cabin was something we hadn't touched in years. It was a small place, nestled just off the shoreline, mostly used for storing fishing gear and as a spot to warm up on colder days. Mom always joked about fixing it up into a proper place to stay, but we'd never gotten around to it. Life had a way of getting in the way of things like that. "Fix it up?" I repeated, setting my mug down. "Like, for us to stay in?" Dad nodded, his fingers tracing the rim of his own mug. "Yeah. I was thinking we could spend more time out there. It could be a way for us to, I don't know, keep her memory alive." I didn't say anything right away, letting the idea settle in. The cabin was old, probably in need of more repairs than either of us realized, but the thought of making it into something more, something we could actually use, sparked something in me. Maybe it was the idea of having a project, something to focus on that wasn't just a constant thrum of grief. "I think that's a good idea," I said after a moment. "It'd give us something to do." "And you're right, she would have loved it." Dad smiled, a real smile, the kind I hadn't seen in a while. "I thought so too." We spent the next couple of days gathering supplies, making lists of what needed fixing and what we'd want to add. The more we talked about it, the more it felt like something tangible, something we could actually work toward. It was strange, feeling a spark of excitement in the middle of all the sadness, but it was a welcome change. The following weekend, we drove out to the lake early in the morning, the bed of the truck loaded with tools, lumber, and everything we'd need to get started. The air was crisp, the leaves just beginning to turn, and the lake shimmered in the early light. For the first time in a long while, it felt like there was something to look forward to. When we got to the cabin, I realized just how much work we had ahead of us. The place was more rundown than I remembered, paint peeling, the roof sagging in places, and the windows fogged over with years of dust and grime. But there was potential there. I could see it. And I knew Dad could too. We spent the whole day working, cleaning out the inside, patching up some of the walls, and making plans for bigger repairs. It was exhausting, but it felt good. Productive. Like we were building something again, instead of just drifting through the days. By the time the sun started to set, we were both covered in dust and sweat, but the cabin already looked a little better. We stood on the porch, looking out at the lake, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't feel weighed down by sadness. It was still there, of course, but it wasn't all-consuming. Dad leaned against the railing, his eyes on the water. "This is good for us," he said quietly. "I think we needed this." I nodded, feeling the same way. Yeah, we did. As we packed up the tools and loaded them back into the truck, I glanced back at the cabin. It was still a long way from being finished, but it already felt like it was becoming something more. Something that would help us heal, little by little. And maybe, in fixing up that old cabin, we were fixing something in ourselves too. The next few weekends followed the same rhythm. Dad and I would load up the truck early in the morning, drive out to the lake, and spend the day working on the cabin. At first, the repairs were small, patching leaks in the roof, fixing the creaky floorboards, and clearing out years of dust and cobwebs. But as we worked, the place started to feel less like an old, forgotten shed and more like something real, something we were bringing back to life. It was hard work, but it was good work. The kind that left you tired in the best way, where your muscles ached but your mind felt clearer. There was something soothing about the routine of it, the way we slowly transformed the place, one board and nail at a time. It gave me something to focus on, something that wasn't just the grief. And I could see it doing the same for Dad. We didn't talk about Mom much while we worked, but she was always there, in the little things. When we decided to paint the cabin, we picked her favorite color, a soft green that reminded me of the garden she used to tend to so carefully. When we replaced the old furniture, Dad insisted on finding pieces that were sturdy, but still had the kind of comfort she would have loved. And as we worked, I'd catch him glancing at the lake now and then, like he was looking for something, or someone, just beyond the horizon. One afternoon, we were halfway through building a new porch swing. The old one had rotted away, but I remembered how Mom used to sit out there, reading her books or watching the water while we fished. It felt right to bring it back, like we were restoring something that had been lost. Dad held up one of the boards, inspecting it before handing it to me. "You remember how she used to sit out here with that big sun hat of hers?" he asked, his voice soft. I smiled, taking the board and lining it up with the frame. "Yeah, and she'd always tell us not to stay out on the water too long. Said we'd come back looking like boiled lobsters." Dad chuckled, the sound warm and familiar. "She had a way of making it sound like a crime, didn't she?" I nodded, hammering the board into place. "She just didn't want us to get sunburned. Or to miss dinner." There was a comfortable pause as we both worked in silence for a moment, the steady rhythm of hammering and sawing filling the air. It felt good to talk about her like that, to remember the small, everyday moments that made her who she was. Not the big, dramatic memories, but the quiet ones, the ones that made life feel full. As we finished up the porch swing, Dad stood back, wiping the sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. "She would have loved this," he said, more to himself than to me. "Yeah," I agreed, stepping back to admire our work. The swing looked sturdy, solid, like it belonged there. Like it had always been part of the cabin. We took a break after that, sitting on the new swing with cold drinks in hand, watching the sunlight dance across the lake. The water was calm, barely a ripple in sight, and the breeze carried the soft scent of pine and fresh wood. For the first time in a long while, I felt a sense of peace. Not the kind that erased the pain or the loss, but the kind that made it a little easier to bear. "I'm glad we're doing this," I said after a while, my voice quiet in the stillness. Dad nodded, taking a long sip of his drink before replying. "Me too. It feels like we're bringing a part of her back, in a way." I didn't say anything to that, but I knew exactly what he meant. Every nail we hammered, every board we replaced, it wasn't just about fixing the cabin. It was about finding a way to hold on to her, to keep her with us in the things we did, the memories we shared. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the water, I felt a sense of accomplishment. The cabin was still far from finished, but it was getting there. And with each day we spent out here, working side by side, it felt like we were building something more than just a place to stay. We were building a connection, a way to move forward without leaving her behind. When we packed up the truck to head home that evening, I glanced back at the cabin one last time. The new swing swayed gently in the breeze, and the soft green paint gleamed in the fading light. It looked right. Like a part of her was woven into it, into every nail and plank. As we drove away, the lake disappeared from view, but I didn't feel the same heaviness I used to. There was still grief, still that deep, aching loss. But there was also hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, we were learning how to live with it. And that, for now, was enough. As the weeks passed, the cabin began to feel like a second home. Dad and I made it a point to go out there every weekend, rain or shine, working on the last few touches. We'd fixed up the roof, added new furniture, and even cleared out a small path down to the water where we could dock the boat. Each time we went, it felt more like a place we could actually stay in, not just a project to keep us busy, but somewhere we wanted to be. One Saturday morning, we decided it was time for something we'd been putting off for a while. The old fireplace inside the cabin was one of the last things left to fix, and while it wasn't in terrible shape, it needed some attention. The bricks were crumbling, the chimney was clogged with years of dirt and leaves, and the hearth was cracked. It was a big job, but it was also something Mom had always wanted to fix up. She used to talk about how nice it would be to have a fire going on cool evenings, the warmth filling the cabin after a long day by the water. As we stood in front of the fireplace, Dad scratched his chin, staring at the mess of bricks and soot. "I remember her saying how this would be the first thing she'd fix if we ever spent more time here," he said with a small smile. "Yeah, she did," I replied, grabbing the broom and starting to clear out the debris. "She had a vision for this place way before we did." Dad laughed softly. "She had a vision for a lot of things. And somehow, she always managed to make them happen." We spent the rest of the morning cleaning out the fireplace, sweeping out the ash, and clearing the chimney. It was tedious work, but I could tell Dad was determined to get it done right. Every now and then, he'd stop and wipe the sweat from his brow, his eyes narrowing as he inspected the bricks or made sure the chimney was clear. I knew why this project mattered to him. It wasn't just about making the fireplace work again, it was about finishing something Mom had wanted. It was a way to honor her. By early afternoon, we had the inside of the fireplace cleaned out and ready for repairs. Dad had brought some replacement bricks and mortar, and we worked together to rebuild the sections that had crumbled away over the years. The sun was starting to dip lower in the sky when we finally stood back to admire our work. The new bricks were a little brighter than the old ones, but the whole thing looked solid, like it was ready to burn again. Dad stepped back, hands on his hips, and nodded approvingly. "She'd be proud of this," he said, his voice quiet but filled with something like satisfaction. I looked at the fireplace, imagining what it would be like to sit in front of it on a cool evening, the flames crackling and casting a warm glow across the room. I could almost hear Mom's voice, see her sitting in one of the chairs, wrapped in a blanket, smiling at us like we'd finally finished what she started. "Yeah," I agreed, a lump forming in my throat. She would be. We stood there for a while, not saying much, just looking at the finished fireplace. The cabin felt complete in a way it hadn't before. The swing outside, the fresh paint, the new roof, those were all important. But this felt like the heart of the place. Like we'd finally brought it back to life. As we packed up our tools and got ready to leave, Dad lingered by the door for a moment. He turned to me with a small smile. "How about we come back next weekend and light it up for the first time? Make a day of it. Maybe even stay the night." The idea caught me off guard. We'd been working on the cabin for months, but we hadn't talked about actually spending the night there yet. Still, the thought of it didn't feel strange, it felt right. "Yeah," I said, smiling back. "I'd like that." We locked up the cabin and headed back to the truck, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the lake. As we drove home, I couldn't help but feel like we were finally ready to do what we'd set out to do all along, make this place a home, not just for us, but for her memory too. Next weekend, we'd light that fire. And it wouldn't just be a symbol of what we'd built, it would be a reminder that some things, like love and family, don't fade away. They burn steady, long after the flame is lit. The following weekend arrived with a crispness in the air that made it perfect for what we'd planned. Dad and I loaded up the truck like usual, but this time we had sleeping bags and a cooler full of food for dinner. There was something different about this trip, a kind of anticipation hanging in the air. We weren't just going to work on the cabin anymore, we were going to stay in it, to enjoy the place we'd spent so much time bringing back to life. The drive to the lake felt familiar, comforting. The trees were just starting to turn, their leaves shifting to shades of orange and gold, reflecting off the calm surface of the water as we pulled up. I could already picture the fire we'd build that evening, the warmth from the hearth spreading through the small cabin, the flicker of flames dancing in the windows. We unpacked and set everything up for the night, laid out the sleeping bags, put away the food, and checked the fireplace one more time to make sure everything was ready. Dad had brought a bundle of firewood, and I stacked it neatly beside the hearth, feeling a small thrill of excitement for when we'd finally light it. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in deep purples and oranges, we started preparing dinner. It wasn't anything fancy, just hot dogs over the campfire outside, but it was perfect for the evening. We sat by the fire pit, the scent of wood smoke filling the air, and for the first time in a long while, the weight of everything felt a little lighter. After we ate, Dad stood up, brushing off his hands. "Ready to light that fire inside?" I nodded, feeling a small spark of excitement. This was the moment we'd been waiting for. We gathered up the firewood and headed inside, the cabin already growing cool as the night air crept in. The fireplace was clean, the new bricks standing strong, ready for the first flames. Dad knelt by the hearth and carefully placed the logs inside. I watched as he struck a match, the small flame flickering for a second before he touched it to the kindling. For a moment, there was only a faint crackling, the fire slow to catch, but then the flames began to grow, licking up the logs, filling the room with a soft, golden glow. We stood there in silence for a while, just watching the fire. The warmth spread through the cabin, and I could feel the tension in my chest loosening, melting away in the heat. It felt like the final piece had clicked into place, like everything we'd worked for these past few months had led to this moment. Dad sat down in one of the old chairs we'd restored, and I took the one next to him. We didn't need to say anything. The fire was enough. It filled the cabin with a sense of peace I hadn't felt in a long time, a kind of quiet comfort that reminded me of all the nights we'd spent together as a family, Mom reading her book by the window, Dad telling stories, the sound of the lake lapping gently against the shore outside. At some point, Dad broke the silence, his voice low and thoughtful. "You know, she's here with us. I can feel it." I didn't say anything right away, but I knew exactly what he meant. It wasn't just the fire or the cabin, it was everything we'd done, all the memories we'd honored along the way. Mom wasn't physically there, but her presence was woven into the very walls of this place. Every nail we hammered, every board we replaced, it was all part of keeping her with us. "I think so too," I said quietly, staring into the flames. "She'd be proud of us." Dad smiled, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "Yeah, she would." We sat there for a while longer, watching the fire burn, the room growing warmer and more comfortable by the minute. Eventually, the flames died down to glowing embers, casting a soft, steady light across the cabin. I felt a sense of calm I hadn't experienced since she passed, like somehow, in building this place back up, we'd also rebuilt something inside ourselves. That night, I fell asleep to the gentle crackling of the fire, the warmth of the hearth spreading through the room. I dreamed of Mom, not in a sad, distant way, but in the kind of dream that feels like a memory. She was sitting on the porch swing we'd built, smiling at the lake as the sun set behind her, her sun hat casting a soft shadow over her face. When I woke the next morning, the cabin was quiet, the fire long since burned out, but the warmth remained. And in that stillness, I realized something. We hadn't just fixed up an old cabin by the lake. We'd found a way to keep her with us, to honor her memory not just in words, but in action. In the things we built together. As we packed up and headed home, I took one last look at the cabin, standing strong against the backdrop of the lake. It wasn't just a cabin anymore. It was home. And in that, there was a kind of peace I hadn't expected but had been searching for all along.